campaign against criminalizing communities and peace in Kurdistan campaign representative Les Levidow. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Les, my first question would be, what do you think about Abdullah Ocalan's ideas for bringing peace to the Middle East, first of all?
In the late 1990s, Abdullah Ocalan led the Kurdish freedom movement into a political transition towards the principles of democratic autonomy and democratic confederalism among all geopolitical areas whose people may adopt that approach. These principles have the capacity to unite all pro-democracy peoples, regardless of ethnic background, as the mass movement in northeastern Syria has demonstrated for the past decade. Only such a mass democracy can bring peace. Öcalan has understood that a peaceful resolution would also require changes in the Turkish state, so that it accepts the decisions by any region to establish democratic autonomy. For example, the new Demokrasi Partisi, DEP, formerly the HDP, has started to rebuild a new democratic movement in Turkey before the Turkish elections on 30th of March.
Thank you, Les. Secondly, what has been the main obstacles to peace between Turkey and the Kurds?
Well, all Turkish regimes have tried to rule Turkey through an ethno-nationalism that suppresses other cultural identities and political dissent. The state uses various pretexts, for example, that dissent supposedly promotes terrorism or insults Turkishness. Such crimes can mean whatever the state wants them to mean. Turkish regimes have seen the Kurdish freedom movement as a threat to their basis for ruling Turkey. Of course, rightly so, because that basis is incompatible with democracy. Here is just one indicator of the conflict. Of all the people detained worldwide under anti-terror laws, about half are in Turkey. This tells us much about the Turkish state.
Thank you, Les. Also, the peace process, as you know, during the peace negotiations between the Kurdish movement and Turkish state, about a decade ago, talks were held with Öcalan on İmralı Island. What was their significance at that point? And what would you like to say about building up a new peace process? Do you think Öcalan's freedom is a crucial in that case?
By negotiating with Öcalan, the Turkish state implicitly recognized that he had a crucial role for any peaceful resolution for several reasons. He personifies the Kurds' demands for democratic autonomy. He commands the respect of the Kurdish freedom movement and understands the need for a stepwise de-escalation. These talks offered a potential pathway to such de-escalation and eventually peace.
Also, would like to ask you about the negotiations process. Why did the negotiations not lead to peace or any agreement at the end of the day?
Through those negotiations and other political changes, the state expected somehow to accommodate the Kurds' demands for cultural autonomy, but not their political demands, and certainly not their chosen political representatives through the Kurdish freedom movement. This strategy did not work for several reasons. The Kurdish left-wing party at that time gained greater support in Turkey's elections, and the Rojava experiment gave the Kurdish movement the opportunity to implement their vision of democratic autonomy, in turn giving greater confidence to Kurds in Turkey for that agenda. So the AK Party regime decided to resume its war against them.
Okay. In the conflict between Turkey and the Kurds, there have been hopes that the US government would provide long term support to Rojava. officially known as Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria. How would you basically how should we see the U.S. role in there?
We should see the U.S. support for Rojava a few years ago as a temporary exception to U.S. foreign policy, especially in the Middle East. Let's remember the big picture there. Over many decades, regimes there have covertly deployed Islamist terrorist groups in order to undermine national liberation movements and progressive forces more generally, while portraying themselves as a counter-terror force. This strategy has had the collusion of the US government as well as the UK government, aiming to prevent a democratically accountable government anywhere in the Middle East. In fact, just like anywhere else. Turkey has exemplified this strategy through its various regimes since the 1980s, eventually supporting ISIS as a weapon against the Kurdish freedom movement in Syria about a decade ago. Consequently, ISIS became a political economic force in its own right, with a territorial base and oil sales, partly through Turkey. This gain for ISIS suited Turkey for attacking the Rojava experiment, but alarmed the US government as a wider regional threat. So the US military sent light arms to the Rojava forces in order to push back ISIS there. It armed the Syrian Democratic Front to defeat ISIS throughout Iraq, and still now depends on the SDF to contain the thousands of ex-ISIS fighters in detention camps. The US government gave this military support despite regarding the Kurdish freedom movement as a political threat to imperialist control over the Middle East.
So, how should we understand the US government reducing military support for Rojava? How should we see this picture?
Well, many Kurdish supporters, the supporters of the Kurdish freedom movement, see this reduction or abandonment by the USA as a betrayal. But this term misunderstands the previous support as if it had been a political commitment to the movement. This was not the case, given the anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist stance of the Kurdish movement, often in a violent conflict with Turkey, a NATO member. Kurdish solidarity supporters have made appeals to the US government to continue its support in order to bring democracy and peace to the region. But the US government has always subordinated such principles to its strategic interests of imperialist domination. So, an international solidarity strategy will need to be politically savvy by recognizing how different interests may converge or diverge, likewise, how they may change over time.
Thank you, Lest. Also, what role is played by the UK political system in that case?
Well, a key political weapon against the Kurdish freedom movement is the UK ban, along with the European Union ban, on the PKK, relating to its symbols such as the flag, Abdullah Ocalan, images of martyrs, and so on. This ban gives the British state a weapon for suppressing all Kurdish organizations and intimidating supporters. It internalizes and imports Turkey's anti-democratic agenda in the UK. The ban also helps to sanitize the UK's material support for the Turkish regime and cooperation with its intelligence services in order to suppress dissent both here and there.
Thank you. Also, let's talk about what else needs to be done about these issues. How can supporters of the Kurdish freedom movement can help in here?
Well, we should continue demanding the release of Abdullah Ocalan and encourage more and more organizations to do so, so far, especially the trade union movement here, we should oppose the ban on the PKK and support anyone who is harassed or prosecuted for contravening the ban. We should oppose Turkey's funding of UK academic units, which thereby undergo a self-censorship, or even worse, promoting the perspective of Turkish regime. And we should oppose all other forms of support for the Turkish regime from the UK, such as academic, trade, and military links, as demanded by the Boycott Turkey campaign.
Thank you. Let's also would like to add you one more question. It's very important. If you can wrap up all this in 1 minute, maybe even less than a minute. As you know, on 10th of October, there was a campaign started globally by the Kurdish Friends. It's Freedom for Öcalan Political Solution for Kurdish Question campaign, and this campaign still continues. How important is this campaign? Also, if you can shortly, briefly tell us why Öcalan should be free and what is your freedom for Öcalan message?
Well, the answer can be both positive and negative. I mean, the reason is partly that his continued detention and Western collusion, both with his original kidnap and his continuing detention, reinforces the power of the Turkish regime to suppress the aims of Kurdish freedom in Turkey, and reinforces the UK collusion with that repression here. I mean, likewise in all other European countries. So his continued detention also prevents any peaceful resolution of the conflict. So if we then ask, well, why is his freedom so important? It's the reverse. It's to reduce or end the Western collusion with the regime in continuing its war on the Kurds and continuing its suppression of their aspirations for democratic autonomy and peace. So that's why it's crucial that all organizations here in the UK and in other countries that are colluding take up the demand for his release.
Thank you, dear Les. Campaign against criminalizing communities and peace in Kurdistan representative Les Levidow. Thanks for joining us. Thank you for your valuable comments today.